How can we preserve nutritional goodness from farm to fork, given the urgent need to produce healthy, affordable, sustainable and culturally acceptable diets for all? This was the theme of the recent Nestlé International Nutrition Symposium held at Nestlé Research in Lausanne, Switzerland. More than 20 leading scientific lights from around the world came together to assess the current scientific evidence with a view to driving action. The pod that you're about to hear was recorded during the symposium, and the speakers refer to content from their presentations, which you can access in full via the YouTube link in the description. The speakers' views are their own. Enjoy the show. So with us, I'm very pleased to say, are Professor David Stern, President and CEO of the Boyce Thompson Institute. David's also Adjunct Professor of Plant Biology at Cornell. And Professor Snapp, who's Program Director at the Sustainable Agrifood Systems Program at CIMMYT in Mexico. Welcome everyone, and turning to you first, David, you discuss how we can harness the natural goodness of plants, and you stress the importance, indeed the difficulty of defining natural goodness, and you focused on naturalness in particular. What in your eyes should we mean by natural or naturalness?
I think if you look in the dictionary and you ask about naturalness, it means that people have not interfered with that. And we need to understand that in the context of agriculture and food systems, that's an unrealistic definition of natural. So clearly we have another meaning for natural in our space of thinking about the sustainability of agriculture and food systems. And I believe that what most people mean when they say natural is they mean something that is going to not harm the environment, that is not going to harm people, or that's going to minimize the impact of that action on the future of the planet, on the future of humanity, on biodiversity. So people take natural as a way of saying low impact or sustainable. Another word that is thrown around a lot, I think, isn't it, Sig? So I think in the world of futuristic plant breeding and plant modification, we have to also grapple with the definition of natural. So one of the big arguments, if you will, and maybe it's philosophical and maybe it's got some science in it, is whether genetically modified plants are natural. So natural is something that we could realistically go out in the world and find somewhere, or can something quote unquote natural because of the low impact be something that we created in the laboratory? So if you said, well, I can put a gene in this, it's going to be a GMO, but as a result, we will sustain biodiversity, we'll sustain soil health. Would that now qualify as naturalness because of the impact after the thing was created? So is the process irrelevant, or is the process what determines naturalness to us in our food system?
I think it was really interesting how you teased out as well the fact that quote unquote conventional plant breeding, which obviously is, farmers have used for millennia, is that natural? You can ask that question as well.
Yes, and in the world of food, so organic in the United States, and I think in Europe, means something specific. There's a regulation about when you can use the term and when you can and all the practices. Natural has no rules. So it's amazing when you go to a store, you go to a farmer's market, how many farmers find labels that aren't organic. We have one in our market that calls it more organic. It's more than organic, whatever that means. There are other people who say all natural. You see it, all natural beef hot dogs, all natural this, all natural that. And the consumer really is at the mercy of the manufacturer in defining that. Now, natural in terms of plant breeding, domestication is somehow seen, I think, as part of our patrimony. It's part of human history. For ever since humans walked the earth, we've gone from the hunter-gatherers to the incipient farmers and now to the breeders. And breeding is considered somehow to be natural because I think it's seen as part of evolution of the human race. So maybe that's how plant breeding allows itself to fall into naturalness. And then when the scientists and the white coats intervene and the organism is created in a test tube, in a laboratory, it's an in vitro effort. It's done in an unnatural way. It's not done outside. Then it becomes unnatural. I think meat grown in a petri dish is probably considered by most people to be unnatural, but supposedly a lower environmental footprint. So I think naturalness goes with us along with something that's coincident with the evolution of humans.
Naturalness, in your view, something that shouldn't harm planet or people and should have a positive impact. What are the implications in this view in terms of harnessing naturalness in this sense through the approaches that you presented today?
Sure. So I talked about three main technologies. One is insertion of genes. We conventionally call that GMOs. We talked about gene editing, which is something new, and we talked about modern plant breeding, which is computationally driven. What I believe, Sig, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but what we search for is traits. We want a trait of some kind. It could be a nutritional trait, it could be a yield trait, it could be a resilience trait. It's some kind of trait. So that is the goal, is to create a trait where it doesn't exist. And we have to look in our toolbox to do it. If you're building a machine or you're fixing a machine, sometimes you need a screwdriver, sometimes you need a wrench, sometimes you need a hammer. We can't, in my view, abandon half the tools in the toolbox and try to do everything with, we have a Swiss Army knife, right? It's got all the different tools on it. They keep getting more tools on those knives too, because there's a right tool for every situation. And I grew up, my dad did all this work in the workshop. He said, get the right tool for the right job. And every time I used the wrong tool because it was closer or because it wasn't as dangerous, I usually broke something. So if your technologies are not appropriate to the goal, the trait goal that you have, the corporate goal that you have, the environmental goal that you have, you're just asking to fail. And are you doing that in the service of, a public image? Are you doing that, who are you really benefiting by making that choice? And is that really your stakeholder that's the most important? Or is your stakeholder the planet? And then you should use the tool that's most appropriate for the job. And this is the hard part, to explain to people the science, to take down the barrier between the scientists and the consumer and the stakeholder, understand where they're coming from and meet them where they are. Don't tell them to meet you where you are. And so I think that is the area where, science communication and education and listening to the public can help bridge the gap. I think avoiding that conversation by using tools that are somehow seen as inoffensive, that will not solve our problems of tomorrow. They're not going to give you the traits. They're not going to move your yields. They're not going to move your nutritional traits, your soil health. We can't afford to leave those in the box because somebody doesn't like the way they look.
What about you, Sieg? Any observations on toolkits or Swiss Army knives since we're in Switzerland, using the tools at our disposal?
I didn't think Switzerland had an army, by the way.
Another topic.
Yeah, well, as I am a program director at CIMMYT, which is the home of the original Green Revolution, which we got to through short-statured crops to give us doubling, tripling wheat and maize yield, I really agree that we need a broader range of options. And in fact, we needed a doubler green revolution, which is something that we talked about today in terms of data-based science. And I'm very excited about some of those options because it takes a different way of doing agronomy than we've ever had in the past. And it's not just about robots and drones, which is sometimes gets all the credit, or vertical farming. It's really about public-private citizen science approaches, and about using machine learning and databases to understand which options have which consequences.
In your presentation, you called for evidence-based science to support more sustainable, nutritious food production. I mean, how can we support that through agronomic practices, plant genetics, soil health, etc.?
Well, in fact, I think we need to stand things on their head in terms of, instead of providing technologies, supply-driven, we need to be more demand-driven and provide more options in capacity building, because the final uptake of technologies is really about adaptation, particularly in a changing world, right? With markets changing, with climate variability, extreme climate, we now need to use our latest technologies, the whole range of options, the different ranges of approaches, but put those in the hands of those that actually all along have been feeding us, the small-scale farmers, people in the global south that have come up with innovations around mobile money and so on. And we really need to empower a wider range of actors, and diversity of, I would say, of plants, of human options is very much what we're aligned with in CIMMYT and other CG centers.
Interestingly, I mean, one factoid that came up in one of the other presentations was the fact that 4/5 of the world's food production comes from smallholder farmers. Do you think in the past we've been sort of behindhand in terms of connecting with these farmers to make sure they can access the latest technologies?
Yeah, whether you think it's 50% or 2/3 that our smallholder farmers are feeding, I think the more important point is exactly what you said, that smaller scale farmers, the future doesn't look just like monocultures, combines. I mean, we want to reduce drudgery, so I think mechanization is very important, and broadening the range of options for all the farmers, rather than just saying we need to have one type of modern farming. Modern farming can look very different in different parts of the world, and I'm glad that's starting to kind of now be at the table. That there's a wider range of people at the table, and again, these public-private partnerships along with civil society is giving us a different type of future.
Indeed, vitally important. And in terms of putting some of these ideas into practice, you touched on an interesting example involving, I think, zinc nutrition in wheat production systems in Ethiopia. You drew out the value of holistic agronomy, combining genetic and nutritional management of soils and crops. Can you unpack this a little more for us, please?
Certainly. I think that it shows that sometimes the soil health, as so much talked about these days, actually can impact plant nutrition, because soils that are deficient in zinc in different parts of the world then tend to produce crops that are deficient in zinc, and ultimately children, we have shown, have less zinc. And as was brought out by an audience member, in fact, that sometimes, depending on the stage of life, can actually, in the end, impact negatively people's health. So it's important to draw those connections. But I think just as important is to look at databases and try to understand who has managed, with very few resources, to still improve their zinc. And maybe it's through dietary diversity. So I think you touched on it. It's about holistic approaches. None of us have the only keys. We have to work together.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, I'm just curious about, we talk about the interface of plant genetics and soil health, but there's also the interface of human genetics and plant genetics. And so, when thinking about the micronutrient deficiencies, do you work with the human geneticists to try to understand if there's certain populations that they're better at getting zinc out of the plants, of the soil, and how about that dimension of it? Does it make it too complicated?
No, I think we have to go there, and that's why epidemiological approaches are so important. They help us get that direction. And we can't forget microbes. To me, it's the plants and their associated microbial communities, and now humans and their microbiomes, that really are getting us there in the end. We have to understand all that complexity, and that's why we knew we need a double green revolution, a different approach. We can't just do the controlled studies that we once relied on. There also needs to be more epidemiological approaches that help us understand, because small-scale farmers have solved some of these problems, and we need to be sure that we understand that whole wide range of options out there.
Great, thank you very much. And sadly, that's all we have time for today. So thank you very much.